Hi friends, and welcome to Breaking Woke, where our goal is to separate good ideas from potentially harmful ones. Today we're talking about Trevor Noah and something that he said in the media last week, and I have both a compliment and a question for Trevor. Let's start with the compliment. Many years ago, before Trevor moved to darkest California and became world famous and made our nation proud in doing so, I had the chance once to introduce him at an event. I was the MC and Trevor was the comedian. And here's something that the audience was not aware of on the day. Something had gone wrong with Trevor's travel arrangements. He was flying back and forth to the US and all over the world as his eminence grew. And by some strange quirk, he ended up having to present that day in a wet suit. He arrived with a suit that was slightly damp, and that was his only option. It had come straight like that from the dry cleaners. And we were aware of it backstage. I got up onto the stage and I introduced Trevor, and he was a consummate professional. He never once referenced the fact that he was physically uncomfortable and that he was wearing this damp suit. The audience adored him, he worked the room like a champion, and his personal discipline and show of character were outstanding. Afterwards, he walks off the stage and shakes hands with us as the conference conveners, and his lips were going numb and he was shivering. But the audience never once knew it, and I've never forgotten that. That was a champion move on Trevor's part. Now, a question. Last week, Trevor was talking about the idea of gender fluidity, and he criticized gender reveal parties, making the point that knowing what we now know, we should wait until the child reveals their own gender. There is a problem with that word knowing, and my question for Trevor is, are you aware of the science, the history, and the academic tradition behind it? I have a book coming out in the next few weeks called Political Correctness Does More Harm Than Good. And as part of that, I've had to research a lot of these very politically correct, very liberal fads and trends. And one of them is this issue. I am profoundly aware of the history of this particular one. It originates with a man named John Money. John Money was the man who posited the theory that gender might be a free-floating construct, a social idea, rather than something that was genetically embedded. He is the first one who posited this theory. Now, here's the problem. How do you test a theory of this nature? John Money encountered a family who had had a tragedy. What had happened in this particular case is that a very young boy, an infant boy, had had a botched circumcision and his penis had been burnt off. John Money approached this family and he said, "Would you like to use your boy as the catalyst to prove this theorem?" And the mother agreed, the family agreed to allow their child to be the guinea pig for this theory, and they raised the boy as a girl. So here's how John Money conducted this experiment. The boy was placed into female clothing from infancy. Now, he himself reports that the boy rebelled against this and tried to pull off dresses whenever he was placed in this female clothing. The boy had an older brother, and John Money encouraged the two boys to interact with one another in sexual ways. Now, let me just pause you there for a second and ask you a question. Do you think there's a chance that this man was evil? What he did was he encouraged these two boys to interact with one another in sexualized gender roles. So the older brother was to play the sexual male, while the younger brother, who was dressed as a female, having had his penis burnt off, was encouraged to be the submissive female in this sexual interaction and this role-playing. At about the age of 16, when it was revealed to this boy that he was in fact born a male and that his penis had been burnt off, he wanted to transition back to being male. His parents tried to warn him against it. They warned him about the dangers of transitioning. Now, I want you to think about the perversity of that for just a second. He was a boy and they were asking him, do you think it's okay for you to transition back to being a boy? This is the experiment on which all of this is based. Now, we get to the end result of all of this. Both boys committed suicide. Two beautiful young lives destroyed by this experiment. And John Money declared his experiment a success. He declared that he had proven that gender was a social construct. This, Trevor, is the science on which this entire edifice is built. This experiment by this evil, fraudulent scientist. Now, since that point, we have an entire academic tradition that has grown up around this experiment, a so-called vetted academic tradition which proves that gender is a social construct. But all of this is premised on John Money's experiment, and a couple of interesting things to know about this. This so-called science does not come to us from evolutionary biology. It comes from the sociology department. In other words, John Money did this experiment, this evil experiment in which two boys ended up destroying themselves. And then further writers from the sociology department wrote their books on top of this experiment, given that we now knew that gender is a social construct. This is the vetted academic history of this idea. It's worth noting as well that the idea of the word science is problematic when we talk about this one. If you are talking about evolutionary biology, then the science is objective. In other words, its point is to falsify bad ideas, and that which remains as unfalsified is the prevailing truth. However, the humanities do not work that way. They are self-professedly subjective. In other words, they are based on feelings and emotions. Based on subjective feelings and emotions, people who have PhDs have written books saying that this is true. When we call this science, we should rather call it science. Now here's where it gets even more problematic. Since that point, the record shows that half of transgender people have attempted to take their own lives. So the fraudulent science on which this idea was based resulted in the subject matters destroying themselves. Since then, half of people who have taken on board this ideology and attempted it have also tried to destroy themselves. And that is even absent any societal pressures such as bullying. That's important to note. Now, Trevor, you stand up on an international platform and you say, given what we now know about gender, we know no such thing. And knowing this led to the destruction of the original subjects of the original experiment, and since then has led to the attempted destruction of half of its participants. Why would we volunteer our children for an experiment of this nature? Here's another question. I'm raising a small child myself. He's a young boy, and he looks to me for adult cues about how to be a man. Under your paradigm, we deny children these cues. We do not teach them how to be a female or how to be a male. Here's a question for you. Do you think that they need these cognitive cues in the same way that children need nutrition in their early and formative years? The answer is, we don't know. We're running this generation as the guinea pigs. Perhaps there is something critically important about being given male cues for a male or female cues for a female. Indeed, in cases where children depart from this, half of them try to destroy themselves. And yet you refer to what we now know about gender. Trevor, we know no such thing. God help us if this experiment turns out to be a liberal fad at the expense of children's lives. We do not know what you are purporting we know. One thing we can be sure of, one thing we do know, political correctness does more harm than good. I deeply admire you, Trevor, and I always have. I'm a little concerned that having moved to darkest California, your thinking today is 100% aligned to that of the Democratic Party. But that's my problem, not yours. You're allowed to toe the party line if you want to. I always thought of you as a very original thinker, but I worry about that particular one. We know no such thing, and that can do more damage than good. God bless you in your career, mate, and well done on making South Africa proud. You really went the full distance.